Hello, my name is Maria Jolicoeur. Welcome to my show, Let's Talk About History. Today I'm at the Congregational Church by the NFA Green, Chelsea Parade Green, and there's going to be a talk about a medium who lived in Norwich in the 1850s. And I'm here with Norwich's historian, Dale Plummer. Dale, can you tell me some more about the gentleman, the medium?
Yes, Daniel Douglas Hume was a native of Scotland, born in Scotland, came here as a young man to live with his aunt and uncle in Greenville. And that's where he first started to manifest his abilities as a medium. He was most famous for levitating, say to the top of a ceiling or
Really?
even out a window.
So how did they first find out, briefly, that he had the ability to maybe be a medium or to pick up, read things like if somebody had a book or maybe a piece of jewelry, he could get vibes from it or something?
Well, he, of course, said that he could communicate. He said he learned about the death of a friend of his through his, abilities and his mother. But also, apparently, furniture in his aunt's and uncle's house would move around, tables and chairs
What
and
about
things.
dreams? Did he ever have any dreams that were...
Yes, and I think we'll be hearing more about those today. But he had quite a very interesting history. He went from here, he went to Hartford, then he went to England and Europe, and was very highly regarded among the wealthy and nobility in England and Europe.
Okay. What was his name again?
Daniel Douglas Hume.
Okay.
It's spelled home, but it's pronounced Hume.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Dale. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy my show. Happy Halloween, and have a safe and happy Halloween. Thank you.
I'm Doug Harlow. I'm talking today about Daniel Douglas Hume, spelled H-O-M-E, but pronounced Hume. He was originally born in Scotland, but when he was 9 years old, he actually moved over here to Connecticut. He actually lived in Greenville, but spent some time in Norwich as well, where he worked. And when he was a teenager, some very unusual things began to happen around him. His mother passed away when he was about 17 years old, and his mother appeared to him at his bedside, and he didn't know she had died. She was living away from the family because he had initially been adopted by his aunt and uncle, so he wasn't living with his natural parents. So his mother appeared to him, and he realized that was her spirit, and so he told his aunt that she had appeared to him, and then they received word very shortly after that she had actually passed away in another town. And so from there on, his mother began to speak to him and told him that he had this glorious mission to spread the word spiritualism, which was becoming very popular in the late 1840s and 1850s in America. This was where these knockings and what called raps began to manifest in some families. It started with the Fox sisters in Rochester, but it quickly spread across the country, and many other people began to experience this as well. And so as a result, Hume heard about that as well, and he began to experience some of this activity shortly after he saw this vision of his mother. His aunt didn't like that. Furniture began moving around the house, so he left the home and began traveling. And progressively wealthier families began to take him up. He would hold seances for them. Word would travel throughout Connecticut and eventually up into Massachusetts and surrounding states. And he worked himself up into some very prominent families here through the mid-1850s. At that point, he decided to go to Europe. They said for health reasons, although it's not quite clear why the weather in Europe was any better for his health. He had bad health his whole life. He had tuberculosis, so he would occasionally cough up blood. He had very bad chest pains and such. And he was always saying that he wasn't expected to live very long. But he ended up living until he was 53. But he went to Europe in the 1850s, and that's where he really became famous. Many very wealthy people in Europe, writers, artists, began to have sittings with him. Many of them were convinced, although not all. The Brownings in particular, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was completely convinced by him and believed that she had contacted spirits. Her husband thought it was all a sham, and they had terrible fights really for the rest of their life over this subject. But eventually Hume went to France and Russia. He gave sittings for Emperor Napoleon III and his wife, Empress Eugenie, and also Tsar Alexander II in Russia. He ended up marrying the goddaughter of Nicholas I, the Tsar Nicholas I's goddaughter. So all of a sudden, this basically lower class Scottish immigrant is marrying into Russian aristocracy. And so his fame persisted throughout the rest of his life, but eventually he got too sick to give seances. He wrote a book near the end of his life that denounced other spiritualist mediums as frauds, which made some of his friends his enemies because many of them supported some of these other mediums.
What got you interested in?
I found out about him about 20 some years ago. I started reading some of the accounts. I was fortunate to be near a library, and so when I started reading the first-hand accounts of his seances, I got drawn in. Reading about things second-hand, third-hand, or something is one thing, but it's when you start reading the actual first-hand accounts, I said, "Whoa, this is really strange and interesting." So this presentation, I'm trying to give as many first-hand accounts as I can, so that you can kind of get a flavor as to what these people were seeing and describing. Because a lot of people, what's interesting about him, and from a historical standpoint, you don't get this very often. Contemporary, somebody writing down something of what's happening at the time in great detail. You don't get that with paranormal subjects. You don't get that even with normal history. Usually memoirs and things are coming down. I remember this, or I remember this person doing that, but it's not noted at the time. And so a lot of Hume there's a lot of very detailed accounts of Hume seances, and some of them have even just come to light in the last 20 years or so.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
We're going to start at 7.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about the Wizard of Norwich. Yes, Daniel Douglas Hume. Now you might notice it's spelled H-O-M-E. His name has a very interesting lineage. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. This picture it looks like he's, in all this. He's actually getting ready. He was going to be playing Hamlet in the 1860s in London. But Charles Dickens was a friend of the theater manager, and Charles Dickens was a big enemy of Hume. Big enemy of spiritualists in general, and so he actually had that production shut down. So Hume never got a chance to play Hamlet, but I believe that's a picture of him kind of getting ready to do that. So I thought I'd start off. I'd like to talk, introduce as many first-hand accounts as possible, because I think sometimes you can get caught up talking about, he did this, he went here, he went there, but it give you a flavor of the seances that were happening, and then we'll get back into where this all started. So in 1852, on August 10th, in the Hartford Times, there was a newspaper article. It was called headlined "A Few Words on an Unpopular Subject." And it was written by Frank Burr, who was a reporter for the Hartford Times. He was brother of Alfred Burr, who was actually the managing editor and was for a long time, very well-known editor. And I believe Alfred was also at this seance with him. So it says, on the 8th instant, in the company with 3 gentlemen from this city, the writer paid a visit to Ward Cheney, residing in Manchester, at whose house Mr. Daniel D. Hume was temporarily stopping. A circle was formed, and the well-known vibrations on the table were soon loud and distinct. One of my friends had never seen anything of the kind, and he accordingly looked under the table to make sure that no one touched it. Answers of a personal character, such as tests of identity, were given very freely. Mr. Hume was then thrown into a spiritually magnetic state, discovering great rigidity of muscle and the ordinary phenomena of the psychomagnetic condition, including a magnetic locking of the jaws and an iron-like hardness of the muscles that were apparent. He then spelt out, with his eyes closely bandaged, some remarkable and interesting messages to two of the company, the personal nature of which precludes their publication, but which were declared by those interested to be perfect tests. He did this by pointing with almost incredible rapidity to the different letters of the alphabet arranged on a 7x9 card, and thus spelling out the necessary words. A rapid writer had difficulty in keeping up with him, and when a word or a sentence was partially finished, a suggestion from any of the company as to what was intended to be spelt would, if correct, be answered by eager and vehement rappings in various parts of the table. Among others, all remarkable, came a message from two sailors lost at sea, relatives of one of the company, a stranger to most of those present. These spirits announced themselves somewhat unexpectedly by canting over the solid and ponderous table and rolling it in the manner of a vessel in a violent tempest. Accompanying this demonstration came a violent creaking of the cables of a ship when strained in a gale. Then came the loud sound of a prolonged wailing, shrieking blast of wind, precisely such as a noise as the wind makes in a rigging of a ship in a storm at sea, and the creaking of the timbers and masts as the vessel surged to one side or the other were distinctly heard by all. Next came the regular sullen shocks of the waves as they struck the bows of the doomed vessel. All this time the table kept up the rocking motion, and now the large table was capsized on the floor. All this was done with no one touching the table, as a close and constant scrutiny was kept up by two at least of our party. These two sailors, whose names and ages were given, it seems lost their lives by the capsizing of a vessel as represented, although this fact I have the best reasons for knowing could not previously be known to Mr. Hume or to any of the company excepting myself. Demonstrations now increased in force and number. Several tunes were rocked out by the table when no one touched it, the circle being seated a couple of feet at least from it. The swing or motion of the table was a full 3 feet from the floor at each elevation, and the tune was kept with singular accuracy. A simultaneous expression from all of the members of the circle attested their recognition of the several tunes as they were thus performed to our satisfaction. Suddenly, and without any expectation on the part of the company, Mr. Hume was taken up in the air. I had hold of his hand at the time, and I felt his feet. They were lifted a foot from the floor. He palpitated from head to foot with the contending motions of joy and fear which choked his utterance. Again and again he was taken from the floor, and... Oh, am I in the way? Sorry. Again and again he was taken from the floor, and the third time he was carried to the ceiling of the apartment, with which his hands and feet came in gentle contact. I felt the distance from the soles of his boots to the floor, and it was nearly 3 feet. Others touched his feet to satisfy themselves. So that was an account early in his life with some prominent people up in near the Hartford area, and he remained very good friends with the Cheney family, who was very well known in the Manchester area. They started the silk manufacturing company up there for his entire life. So some quick notes. We'll go through this more in detail, but he was born in Scotland in 1833. When he was 9, he moved to Greenville with his aunt and uncle. He was adopted by them when he was 1 year old. It's not clear why. He was a sickly infant, apparently, but I don't know why he was given over to his aunt and uncle as a result of that. But he was. So he came over here with them. He becomes a spirit medium in 1851, and we'll talk about why in just a bit. In 1855, he goes to England, and that's where he really gains true fame with the high, nobility. In fact, he marries a Russian aristocrat in 1858, who's the goddaughter of Tsar Nicholas I. So you have a lower-class Scottish immigrant who ends up marrying Russian nobility, which was unheard of. I mean, even today might be unheard of. It certainly was unheard of in the 1800s. The best man in his wedding was Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers, among many other things. He was his best man, and he had Dumas very humorous and had a very interesting description of his travels with Hume during his wedding party. In 1863, he writes his autobiography, Incidents in My Life. In 1868, he has a very famous trial with a widow, which we'll talk about, which damages his reputation. But then he restores it with scientific demonstrations with the scientist Sir William Crookes. And that makes a big rouse in the papers. He marries, his first wife dies of tuberculosis, which he had. He suffered tuberculosis all his life. It's very likely that she contracted it from him. So she dies in 1861. he remarries in 1872 to another Russian aristocrat. He retires from his mediumship about 1875. His health really starts to decline. And in 1877, he actually writes a book called Lights and Shadows of Spiritualism, where he basically tears other mediums apart and exposes them as frauds. And this causes him to lose a lot of his existing friendships with other spiritualists who believe in those people. And I mean, his whole life, some people said he was jealous of other mediums, but in some of the instances, the mediums he said were frauds were frauds, and they were caught out in it too. And then in 1866, he dies. So a lot of his information, is from his own books and his wife's books. He wrote Incidents in My Life in 1863, and then in 1872 is kind of a volume 2 of that, with events up to that point. And then once he dies, his wife writes 2 books. And so these books, Incidents in My Life, he won't spell out people's names to spare them embarrassment for being associated with the subject. So a lot of reviewers say, well, he's making all this up. Because it's D, dash saw this, or Mrs. H saw this. I don't know who Mrs. H is. But his wife filled in the blanks of all those people, and she prints out a lot of the letters that were written to him throughout his life. There's a huge collection of his letters in Cambridge University in England. And the letters were examined, and they were all legitimate. They were not forged or anything. And so his wife's books in particular are very valuable historical information. So to give you a little background as to where spiritualism came from in the first place, you actually have to go back, into the 1600s and 1700s. Emanuel Swedenborg, maybe some of you may have heard of him. He was a very prominent scientist and an inventor, philosopher. He did all kinds of things. He ran mines in Sweden. Very prominent figure. Very secular figure, wasn't really interested in religion or anything. But he started having some strange dreams, which he started to note down. And when he was in his 50s, he was at a tavern eating, and he said the whole room changed all of a sudden. And he saw this person in the corner, and the person said, "Don't eat so much." And that was kind of the first vision that he started to open up this whole spiritual realm where he believed all of a sudden he was communicating with spirits. Prior to Swedenborg, the belief of contacting spirits, it was more angels. It was not individual people per se that you were communicating with. That started with Swedenborg, where he said, yes, your grandmother can come back and talk to you. Now, he also believed that there were sort of non-human entities also that would be contacted, and he believed you had to stay away from all of that and everything else. He also had a lot of what we would call psychic events. His most famous was he was at a party in Copenhagen, and he got up all of a sudden and started pacing around the room, and they said, and he said he was talking to himself, and he said there's a great fire in Stockholm, which was about 300 miles away. And he described this fire and how it was spreading through the city. And then he said, "Oh, thank goodness it spared my home. They put it out before it got to my house." And everybody said, well, "How does he know that? How does he even know this?" And then it turned out, apparently, that they found out a couple of days later that yes, there had been this huge fire in Stockholm when he said it had happened. Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, was very interested in all of this. Kant wrote a very negative book about Swedenborg, but privately in his letters, he was very interested. He had people making inquiries about his psychic abilities, and it bothered him and puzzled him a lot. But he was, the Swedenborgianism, there's, a Swedenborg church. Helen Keller was a Swedenborg. Dr. Oz is a Swedenborg, I believe. So there is a Swedenborg. It's the new church, and they have their own religion here, where they believe that contact with spirits. Now there was also mesmerism. So Franz Mesmer is a German physician in the 1700s. Developed this concept of animal magnetism. Basically, the whole concept of magnetism was coming, and so he believed in this fluid, this magnetic fluid that enveloped everybody, and that could be manipulated. And he found this strange procedure using like a tub of water, and it was just this strange ritual, but it would put these people into trance, and then weirdly strange things. It was like hypnotism, but it was much more violent. And strange things could happen. You could prick people with pins and things, and they wouldn't feel any pain. And then in some instances, they started having clairvoyance. They could see things, psychic abilities they would demonstrate. And so these two things kind of overlap, the mesmerism and Swedenborg, and it kind of gave birth to this whole movement of spiritualism. And it started with the Fox sisters in Rochester, near Rochester, New York, in 1848 in March. They lived in a cottage. This was the cottage, burned down in, I think, the 50s. And it was actually moved to a spiritualist camp up there called Lilydale. But all of a sudden, there were 3 girls and their parents, and these knocks were heard in the house, just knockings on the walls and things. And it started to, it alarmed the family. Neighbors started to come over, and they started to find out that you could actually communicate with this, that if you would put your finger, you'd have an alphabet out. This was kind of before the Ouija board, but it was what became the Ouija board. You would have an alphabet, and that's what Hume was doing in that account I talked about. You run your finger across the letters, and when it hits the letter that is supposed to be communicated, you'll hear a rap. And then you do that again. And then it can be kind of cumbersome, but actually people would say you could do it pretty quickly after a while once you got used to it. So this spirit that they apparently contacted he said it was a peddler who had come to this house prior to when the Foxes lived there. There was another man who lived there named Bell. And this peddler said he came there, and he tried to sell some of his things, and this man, Bell, murdered him and buried him in the basement. So, of course, they go down and they dig up through the basement. And there's always been, they found bones, but no, some people say, well, it's never been established. Was it an animal bone or was it a human bone? It's not been clear. But anyway, this whole thing exploded. The 3 sisters seemed to be the origin of these rapping sounds. And they traveled the country. Barnum had some interest in them. And they gave seances, particularly Kate, who's the middle one in this picture, and Margaret, who's the one on the left. And they were kind of managed by their older sister, Leah. But, a lot of people said, well, they're frauds. And in 1888, Margaret confessed that they had hoaxed the whole thing, that they would crack their knee joints and their foot joints and things like that. And that's how they would make the raps. And she actually was on stage giving this tour where she explained how it was done, and she made a lot of money off of it. She was alcoholic. She was broke. They all were. And then shortly after that, she said, no, never mind. I just made that up. They were real after all. So it's always been, it's always been nebulous as to whether, what was going on there. And that's going to be that's the case with a lot of spiritualism. It's never clear. But there's been a lot of interesting things written about the Fox sisters, but they were the beginning. And then what's interesting is you can go through these newspaper articles and you can see how they're talking about the Fox sisters, and then all of a sudden it's, oh, wait a minute, now this is happening in Aurora, New York. Now this is happening over here. Now this is happening over there. This spread very quickly. I mean, obviously well before the internet. I mean, really just the telegraph and everything. But how quickly these rappings and things spread through the U.S. was very remarkable. Now, to just give a little brief overview, in the mid-1800s, there were a lot of challenges going on to traditional religion. Geology was finding out that the Earth was a lot older than a few thousand years. There were a lot of textual critics, historians and such, doing textual analysis on the Bible. And then, of course, you had Darwinism and the whole concept of evolution coming out. So Darwin's there on the upper left. The man on the right, though, prior to Darwin, these ideas were coming to light already. The man on the right is named Robert Chambers, and he wrote a book called Vestiges of Creation, which made a big hubbub before Origin of the Species. It was published about 10 years beforehand. And it wasn't the same as Darwin. Chambers wasn't a scientist, but he was he was up to date on a lot of this, and he had the same kind of idea that Darwin did. And he published that in the late 1840s, anonymously. It was written anonymously, and it caused a big furor about it. Now, this is Alfred Russel Wallace. He was developing the concept of evolution about the same time as Darwin. And in fact, Darwin published Origin of the Species in 1859, much earlier than he wanted to. He was kind of slow walking it. And Wallace was writing to Darwin and saying, hey, I've found out this and this and this and this, and what do you think about this? And Darwin realized, hey, he's kind of on the same track as I am. I better publish this and get to it first. So Darwin, beat him to the punch, but Wallace was thinking along the same lines. What's interesting, though, was that Alfred Russel Wallace became a devout spiritualist, so much so that he would go challenge magicians and claim that they were spirit mediums, that they would perform tricks on the stage, and he would say, well, you must be a medium too because you're doing magic. he got shown up for making some big mistakes. He was what we would call credulous about magic. He didn't know anything about it, so he could get fooled. But he became a very big spiritualist and a very big prominent member of the movement. Robert Chambers was also converted to spiritualism by Hume in around 1860 and became a big supporter of his. And Darwin didn't have a sitting with Hume, but he almost did. His cousin, Francis Galton, we're going to talk about Sir William Crookes, but Galton had Crookes invited him to a seance. Galton, who was he was a prominent scientist at the time as well, saw a lot of weird stuff and said, wow, this is actually pretty interesting. I don't know what's going on here. And he wrote to Darwin saying, hey, we should go in and investigate this stuff together. And Darwin said, well, you do it. He's like, I'll trust you. I'm going to leave that to you. So Darwin kind of begged off on it, but he was, for a time, he was interested in that. It'd be interesting to see what would have happened if Darwin had ended up having a seance with Hume. Now, Hume, of course, was not. There were many, many spiritualist mediums. It really exploded in the 1850s and 60s and continued through the end of the 1800s. These people up here are the Davenport brothers. They were very well known. They were sort of mediums. They wouldn't claim that they were spiritualists. They had managers. It was very much a magic performance. They would be locked into that cabinet there. There was two of them, and those are their two managers in between. But they would get tied up, and they'd be put into this cabinet, and the doors would be closed, and the lights would be turned out, and then all of a sudden, all this stuff would start happening. These tambourines and things would be thrown out, and people would get touched in the audience, and it was very much a theatrical performance. It would be like, a cabinet up here, and everybody sitting here, and you paid money, and you watched this. There are other mediums. This was Mrs. Guppy, and this is like sort of a character. She was apparently transported from one room to somebody else's house, like 3 miles away, and they turned the light on, and she was standing on a table in a trance, and said, how did I get here?" And the press had a lot of fun with that. This was Charles Foster. He was a very successful but fraudulent medium. He specialized. He would write on his arm. Messages from the spirits would come on his arm and appear on his arm. And a lot of people were convinced. Where? Well, Foster, he was from Salem, Massachusetts. So he was an American. Mrs. Guppy was English. So initially it was an American phenomenon. Eventually in the 1860s and 70s, more English mediums started to appear as well. And then Florence Cook, she got involved with Crookes, perhaps in more ways than one, which damaged his reputation for a time in that. But what made Hume unique, there are all these mediums, but, okay, so many of these mediums charge fees. You would pay money. Many of them held seances that in, dark rooms, sometimes, complete darkness. Everything was blocked out. They were usually held in their own rooms. They would come and rent an apartment or something, and it was their own place, which means that they had plenty of time to set up trapdoors and all kinds of things if they wanted to. Some of them oftentimes work together, which gives them more. There's a lot more you can accomplish with 2 people or 3 people. And they had managers and husbands and wives, and they, And their repertoires were generally limited, and most, not all, but most were eventually exposed in fraud, especially when they started doing what we call materializations, figures coming out. And oftentimes it was turbans and beards, and that, you know, they started transitioning to this thing where people would come out of this cabinet behind a curtain, and they were supposed to be tied up, but there is no such thing as being... There are always ways, if you know how to do it, there are ways to get out of being tied up in rope. Houdini was, you know, excelled at that, but these were preceding that and really kind of gave way to the kind of magic that, you know, escape magic that Houdini did. A lot of spiritualism really, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, set the stage for magic. Many magical effects had their element from borrowing from what the spiritualists were doing. But Hume, he did not accept payment. Now, he did accept gifts. He amassed about 20 or 30 rings. Many royalty gave him rings. I have no idea what ever happened to them. I'm sure they're worth a fortune. He was given certain things. And some people would say, okay, him not accepting payment worked in his favor because I didn't pay anything. Okay, maybe this was fraudulent, but he didn't charge me money, so I'm not mad about it. Whereas somebody who charges money and says they're doing this, and I find out they're a fraud, I'm going to be mad. I'm going to expose them. So that could work. You know, that could have worked in his favor. But normally, you know, his seances were generally held in good light, at least initially. Now, sometimes he said, you know, all the spiritualists felt that light inhibited the phenomenon. You could get greater phenomenon from less light. So he would, with people that he felt like they had enough sittings, they were convinced, he would turn the lights down and they would see more things. But generally, compared to other mediums, the seances were held in very good light. They were always held in other people's homes. He would come to their house and give the seance. So there was not much time in many instances for preparation or something like that. He couldn't be rigging up a trap door or anything in somebody else's house. Usually just gave seances on his own. He's never openly been caught in fraud. There were some people that said, you know, I thought I saw, you know, this or that, but it was always kind of vague. The accusations are not very strong. And there's a large amount of firsthand contemporary accounts of his mediumship. So some of the phenomena, I mean, raps and knockings, that was common to all mediums. There's many different ways to accomplish that by trickery, not just knee joints and things. They had all kinds of mechanical knockers and things. They were spiritualists. I mean, eventually it got to the point where, you know, you could, you know, if you got into this trade, there were magazines and clubs where you could purchase equipment and things to make all these things happen. But with Hume also, oftentimes the room would start to shake. And a lot of people described it like an earthquake. That the whole room, the tables, their chairs, everything would start to shake. And sometimes even people outside of the room, servants, animals, and things would notice that. Objects in the room would move. Chairs, tables, sofas. There's oftentimes a lowering of the temperature and people notice it got really cold, and sometimes you'd feel wind. There was oftentimes accordion, not his own. It wasn't his accordion, but other people would provide an accordion, which was a popular instrument at that time. Smaller than what, you know, we're not thinking of like a big harpsichord kind of thing, but you'll see a picture of this later. They're small. He would hold it from the key end would be down, and it would start to play. And it would go up and down, and, you know, the bellows would come in and out, and the keys would move and things. And sometimes, you know, he would give it to somebody else. Well, oftentimes he would just let go of it, and it would go under the table to somebody sitting across the room. And when we're talking about tables, you know, we're talking about tables like that. You know, we're not talking about like a little card table. We're talking about fairly substantial tables. And so sometimes other people could hold the accordion and it would start to play in their hands as well. The table, and this was common for a lot of mediums, but with Hume's case, again, these were very large tables. Oftentimes they would tilt on their legs, And what people would notice with his seances that they didn't with others, so like that table there with that flower, that would tilt. And the vase and the flowers or the candles or the lamp would not move. It would tilt almost down to the ground and it would not move. It was like everything on the table was stuck to it, like a magnet. Hume would levitate. We've already seen an account of that. Spirit hands would be seen, and arms would materialize. Sometimes under a tablecloth, you'd see this thing kind of come up, but then it would come out from under the tablecloth, and they could actually feel the hands, and then sometimes they would just be floating in the air. And Frank Burr actually gave an account where oftentimes people would hold them, and they'd feel around them, and there was nothing there. And then they said it was like they would grip it harder, and it would just vanish, like it would just go like that. And Frank Burr described a seance where he actually put his finger into it. Like he said, it was like putty, and he put a finger in it, made a hole in it, and then he pulled his finger out, and it just kind of closed up around it.
Did he ever have experienced dreams that were like visions?
He had vision. Yes, he had some visions and some dreams and such. But yes, but I mean, mostly, yeah, it was communications.
Dreams that were like warnings or something.
Well, he saw Lincoln's assassination.
Oh, wow.
Now, we don't have an account of that prior to Lincoln being assassinated, and even if we did, I don't think predicting that Lincoln was going to be assassinated was so much of a stretch. But he claims that yes, in 1864 he had a vision of Lincoln being shot, and he warned some people. He was in Europe, and he told some people about it, and then it happened several months later. But not too. I mean, he did have some predictions of the future, but not many.
Was that popular like back in the 80s or something when people were listening to their dreams more and they had dreams?
Oh yes, well, and Swedenborg. I mean, he was very big on dreams, and he kept a dream journal and everything. And yeah, that's always been that goes back. I mean, off and on. These things kind of come around again. You see a lot of this repeated. But with Hume, some of these things you don't see repeated. So his body would elongate. In the late 1860s, he started having these things where his body would elongate, and he could also start handling hot coals. So this is an account here. It says this was a woman, Barbara Honeywood, who was sitting with him. As to the burning, I'll play the video too. This is a Dutch production. I've never seen the full thing. There's clips of it on YouTube. It was done back in the 80s. I didn't put the sound with it because it's kind of weird. It's a Dutch production, and then they dubbed it over in Italian. As to the burning coal placed in my hand, I saw Mr. Hume take this coal from the fire, moving his hands freely among the coals. It was about the size of a coffee cup, blazing at the top and red hot at the bottom. While I held it in my hand, the actual flame died out, but it continued to crackle and be partially red hot. I felt it like an ordinary stone, neither hot nor cold. Mr. Hume then pushed it off my hand with one finger onto a double sheet of cartridge paper, which it at once set on fire. So Hume could do this. Now, magicians said, okay, well, there's ways that you could do this. I mean, sometimes Houdini came up and had said, oh, you put this solution of mercury or something on your hand, which is nonsense. Houdini had a lot of nonsense explanations for spirit phenomenon. But, what was interesting about it was not just, there are ways that, he could have substituted that or something. But what he would do is he would oftentimes give it to somebody else. Somebody else would hold it in their hand. They could feel it warm. And somebody else might touch it and they would burn. But the person themselves could hold it. And so, the way it's described is very difficult to explain in any. Yes, well, and Hume, when he would do this, he was oftentimes in trance when he would do this. So usually he would start his seances normally as everybody else would. But he would sometimes go into trance where he'd be taken over by other spirits. And so, and usually when he was doing the fire test, he was being possessed by something else. So he would say, Dan is now taking a coal out of the fire. Watch Dan do this, watch Dan. And he would speak in the third person about and he would say, do you have faith? Usually it was something he would say, do you have faith? You do, and he would start holding it to somebody and say, you'll burn. You do not have the faith. But then he would go to somebody else. He said, you have faith. And he would put it into their hand and they'd be fine. But then other people, said that they had blisters that for years trying to hold the coals and they burned themselves. Oops. So in Connecticut, we talked about the Cheneys. This is the Cheney family. That's Ward Cheney right there. But these were his brothers. They all started, most of them started the silk manufacturing company there. Very prominent family, very wealthy family. And they were very interested in spiritualism. One of the brothers was an artist, and he painted the Fox sisters. So they were acquainted with them. This was Bishop Thomas Clark. He he was Bishop of Rhode Island, although he was initially bishop over in Hartford. He was very, very privately very interested in spiritualism, but in his archives now, that's all been cleared out. So I think he definitely didn't. He wanted to keep that quiet, but there's many letters between him and Hume. He was a big friend of his early in his life. This was Benjamin Cutler Gilson. He was a prominent geologist. He, if you know the Willimantic, the Gilson, yes, he was part of that family. I don't know whether he lived in that house, the museum, or not, but he was part of that family there. He was about Hume's age. They went to school together, and he was very friendly with him throughout his life. Increase Carpenter, who was a mayor of Norwich. Also grew up with Hume over in Greenville, and he was very good friends with Hume and had very complimentary things to say about him. Thomas Seymour was governor of Connecticut in the 1850s. He was also at some seances. I haven't found a whole lot of information with him, but he seems to have been friendly with Hume. And when he was in Russia, his attaché was Daniel Coit Gilman, who was a prominent figure here, who went on to be first president of Hopkins. So it's likely Coit Gilman also knew Hume, if not here, but over in Russia when he was there. They were there about the same time Hume was in Russia. So I'm sure that there was some overlap there, but I don't have any actual records. And then this man is Henry Champion Deming. So he was mayor of Hartford in the 1850s. And he had a seance. He wrote a very long letter into the Hartford Courant in 1858, talking about he had read something where it was disparaging Hume, some article, and he said, "Hey, hold on a second." He's like, "This guy is not what you're saying he is." And he relates this seance that he had in 1855, and he actually draws this. They actually include the drawing of the table, which kind of gives you a sense as the size of these tables. So this one is almost 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and he said it weighed about 150 pounds. And what's interesting is he, in his archives, which are at the Connecticut Historical Society, he has a scrapbook of newspaper clippings, including the one that he wrote. And he actually writes in the newspaper article, it's just Mr. D, Mrs. He doesn't put the names. But then in his own copy, he actually writes in who these people were. And Brownell is actually Henry Brownell, who was a famous poet in Hartford. So some of these people, and Mr. and Mrs. Day were the editors of the Hartford Courant. So, current, I'm sorry. So when he goes to Europe in the 1850s, he starts to give seances to royalty. Alexander II in Russia, who emancipated the serfs, is considered to be a very, I think a pretty good leader historically looking back. Emperor Napoleon III, who's not considered to be a very good leader, he kind of seized power. He was part of the elected republic, and then he seized power and became emperor. He was the cousin of Napoleon the First. and that was his wife, Empress Eugenie, and they had the Second Empire, they called it, where they developed these very lavish palaces and things. But they had a seance with Hume. Hume in 1857 came to France, and that was there's a lot of information there. The press had an enormous field day with that. It was a big deal. He was a very mysterious figure in France. He didn't speak French very well at that time, so he was very quiet, and he really spooked a lot of people. And so Napoleon had him over to the Tuileries Palace, which it's not there anymore, but it's an enormous palace in Paris. And these huge chandeliers and everything. So the rooms were very well lit, and a lot of candles and everything else. And the first seance, this hand appeared and took up a pen and wrote the name Napoleon I in his handwriting. Her father, she was from Spain. Her father spoke to her and everything, so they had a very convincing seance with him, and they had seances with him for many years afterward. Wilhelm I in Prussia, and actually these two went to war in 1870, and Prussia won, which eventually led to the formation of unified Germany. But he also had he was a good friend of Hume's. He had very convincing seances, so he claims. Sophie of Netherlands, and then that is the King of Bavaria there. Then there's many more. And many artists, when he went to Europe, many artists and writers were very convinced by him. This was John Bright. He was a famous economist. John Ruskin, very well-known Victorian. Anna and Samuel Carter Hall, they were probably Hume's biggest patrons. Hume spent a lot of time with them. The Brownings, and this was Robert Bulwer Lytton. So if you've ever heard "It Was a Dark and Stormy Night," or "The Pen is Mightier Than the Sword," that he was the one who wrote that. He wrote a lot of horror stories, and he was very interested in the occult. And so, of course, when Hume came over there, he was very interested to have him come visit. So Hume was born in Curry, Scotland, which is near Edinburgh. He claims, and his very early life, there's not a lot about it, so we have to kind of take his word for it. But he claims that his cradle was rocked when he was an infant. Now, his mother was very psychic, and she foresaw a lot of things, including she foresaw her own death. Her daughter, her daughter drowned when she was very young. And she claims that she saw her daughter in a vision appear to her and tell her that she had 4 years left or something, or 4 months left to live, which she told to Hume. His father worked in a paper mill. Now, it's interesting. His father made the claim that he was the illegitimate son of the 10th Earl of Hume, the Earl of Hume family. Spelled H-O-M-E, but pronounced Hume. And there's actually documentary evidence to back this up. Hume himself, Daniel, when he was getting married, was very interested. He had to put a proof of his lineage. He needed his birth certificate. So he went over there and he started making inquiries with the Earl of Hume's family and everything about his father. And there is evidence, there were payments that were being made to a William Hume back in the early 1800s. And there's some other things that are that back up support. Short of a DNA test, we can't be certain. But it's very likely that, yes, his father was the illegitimate son. Apparently, the Earl had a baby with a poor peasant woman, told her he was going to marry her, and then said, "Oh, I was just kidding." And then she died from the shock, apparently. Probably committed suicide because of it. And so that's the story there. But yeah, he was adopted. Daniel was adopted by his aunt, Mary Cook, at the age of 1. And they move over to Greenville. And so his uncle, Adam Cook, very likely he was a paper manufacturer too. So he probably worked in the Chelsea Manufacturing Company, which is some of the, I don't know, from what I could gather, those were built in 1860. I think there were some there before, because it goes back to the 1830s. So that's the ones that are there now are probably not the ones he worked in. But it's very likely that they lived right near that paper mill, 4th, 5th Street, 6th Street area in Greenville. Hume joined the Congregationalist Church, very likely in Greenville, the one that's there, and is still there. This is an older picture of it. He was called Scotchy by other children. Some of the people that grew up with him remember him. You know, they would call him Scotchy. And he had a friend, Edwin, and they liked to share ghost stories. And so they would go out into the woods. They would talk about ghosts. And they made this pact, he and Edwin, that the first one of them to die would appear to the other one and tell them that there was life after death. Well, Hume and his family briefly move up to Troy, New York. And while he's there, he's about 13 years old. He sees the spirit of Edwin, like from about the waist up. He's at the side of his bed. And he kind of makes a circular motion, and then he disappears, and Hume realizes that he must have died, and then he finds out a few days later that he did die. Now, this is all on his word, so I don't even know. I've tried to track down there's several Edwins that were living in this area at that time that could have fit the criteria. It's not clear who exactly it could have been. And then Hume, gets a job when he's about 17 years old as a tailor's apprentice on Main Street. Now, I thought it was this building here. It was 108 Main Street, but Mr. Plummer informs me that the numbers were changed in the late 1800s. So what was 108 Main Street now may not have been 108 Main Street then. But he worked somewhere along Main Street as a tailor for an Edward Worthington. So his mother tells him that she's going to die, and then she's not living with them. And I've uncovered some circumstantial evidence that she may have been mentally ill. I mean, he said somebody who knew him early in his life says that he says that she went mad, which is possible. I think that there's evidence that her husband was drunk and would beat her. And then her daughter dies, so it's very possible she might have had a kind of breakdown or something. My theory is she may have been in a hospital or something at that time when she passed away, because she says she wasn't around anybody that she knew. She was in a different place or something. But he's asleep one night again, just like the Edwin situation, and he hears a voice say, Dan, 12 o'clock. And he says, I turned my head, and between the window and my bed, I saw what appeared to be the bust of my mother. I saw her lips move, and again I heard the same words, Dan, 12 o'clock. A third time she repeated this and disappeared from my sight. I was extremely agitated and rang the bell hastily to summon my aunt. And when she came, I said, Auntie, Mother died today at 12 o'clock, because I have seen her, and she told me. She said, Nonsense, child, you are ill, and this is the effect of a fevered brain. It was, however, too true, as my father found on going to see her that she had died at 12 o'clock and without the presence of a relative to close her eyes. So that's where he says he begins to see spirits and this mission begins. That's what he says. Now, I uncovered something in the Springfield Republican. There was somebody who wrote in. He only uses initials HR. But he describes in pretty good detail, I don't think he would make this up out of thin air. He's the one that says, Hume was an apprentice for Mr. Edward Worthington, merchant tailor of this city in Norwich in 1849, 1850. He was a tall, rather unsophisticated Scotch boy. And about 1850, he attended a mesmerist demonstration. We talked about mesmerism. So there were these people who would go around and do these demonstrations, and people would come and see them. And so this gentleman was giving a demonstration at Franklin Hall, which was here in Norwich, not here anymore. We tried to trace it down, I think. And he asked for a volunteer on stage. And he saw Hume, and he thought Hume looked kind of strange and peculiar. And he said, he would be a good subject. So he brings him on, and he puts Hume into trance. And apparently Hume, he would drink. The man would drink different wines while Hume was blindfolded, and Hume would could tell what kind of wine it was. He could feel it in his lips. It was like being transferred. That was like something that they would do with mesmerism. There was like transference. Like I would prick myself, and that person would feel it, even if they couldn't see that it was happening or anything. They would say, like, I can feel. Yeah, and so he demonstrated. So that's kind of an interesting crossover, and that's not been described by anybody else, any of his other biographers. They've not seen this account, but it's an interesting overlap with that Hume's beginnings may have started as more of a mesmerist demonstration, and then proceeded to spiritualism. But anyway, while he's at home, things start moving around the house. He's combing his hair one day, and this stool starts moving across the floor, which scares him, and he runs downstairs. And starts having the wrappings in his house, and his aunt gets very disturbed by all this. So she calls in 3 ministers in Greenville, and they all come in and say, we don't we don't know what to do about this. And there was an account that I have that suggests that Hume was kicked out of the Congregationalist church in Greenville because he would come to church and the knockings would follow him there, and they didn't like that, so they asked him to leave. And his aunt asked him to leave. She doesn't like any of this going on. So he goes to another aunt's house that lives nearby, and that's where this other aunt is more sympathetic, and she says, why don't we try to, they hear about the Fox sisters and how maybe these knockings are trying to tell us something. So they do the alphabet thing, and the message is spelt out, Daniel, fear not, my child, God is with you. And who shall be against you? Seek to do good, be truthful and truth-loving, and you will prosper, my child. Yours is a glorious mission. You will convince the infidel, cure the sick, and console the weeping. And so that was his apparent mission. So from there, he starts to basically become a traveler. He never lives in one spot for any particular length of time. He first goes to Willimantic and is with a family there. There's a newspaper article printed about his seance there. Then he goes to Lebanon, Connecticut, stays with the Eli family. It was actually a pretty well-known, up in that area, pretty well-known family. Zebulon Eli is a well-known figure up there, religious figure. Then he goes to New Jersey, and then Springfield, Massachusetts, where he meets Rufus Elmer, who's a pretty well-known boot maker, shoe manufacturer. And so these are middle, upper-class people that he's starting to work with. And Elmer has a lot of seances, and they have a lot of people over, and that's where he really starts to become pretty famous. Then he goes to Manchester, the Cheneys, and then he meets the Jarvis family in Boston. This is Deming Jarvis, who I think, when I looked him up, I was like, wow, this guy looks like Anthony Hopkins. I think. And then his son, James Jackson Jarvis, who was a famous art critic. Deming Jarvis, if you've heard, Sandwich Glass Company is a very famous glass company up in Sandwich, Massachusetts. Deming Jarvis, yeah, he was the one who ran that. They were a very well-known family there, and their son was a very prominent art critic at the time. And they were big spiritualists, and they were very convinced by Hume. James Jackson Jarvis he was very friendly with a lot of the prominent artists in Europe. So it was really him who kind of opened the doors for Hume when he goes over to Europe here. And Jarvis had a very interesting seance where he he actually slept in the same bed with Hume. He stayed the night and slept in the same bed, and he said these figures would appear, and he stuck his finger into them. He said it was like a sponge, like these weird heads and things. So I mean, that was another thing. These things would happen even when Hume was quote unquote asleep or something in bed. These strange things, and the bed came off the floor. And the Cheneys described something similar too when he was staying over there. They said that you couldn't sleep in the same room with him because the bed would come off the floor at night. So this was a article in the Springfield Republican in 1852. It was called the Modern Wonder Manifesto. And it says, the undersigned, from a sense of justice to the parties referred to, very cordially bear testimony to the occurrence of the following facts, which we severally witnessed at the house of Rufus Elmer in Springfield on the evening of the 5th. The table was moved in every possible direction and with great force when we could not perceive any cause of motion. the table, was forced against each one of us so powerfully as to move us from our positions, together with the chairs we occupied, in all several feet. Mr. Wells and Mr. Edwards took hold of the table in such a manner as to exert their strength to the best advantage, but found the invisible power exercised in an opposite direction to be quite equal to their utmost efforts. In 2 instances at least, while the hands of all the members of the circle were placed on top of the table, and while no visible power was employed to raise the table or otherwise move it from its position, it was seen to rise clear of the floor and to float in the atmosphere for several seconds, as if sustained by some denser medium than air. Mr. Wells seated himself on the table, which was rocked for some time with great violence, and at length it poised itself on 2 legs and remained in this position for some 30 seconds when no other person was in contact with the table. 3 persons, Mr. Wells, Bliss, and Edwards, assumed positions on the table at the same time, and while thus seated, the table was moved in various directions. And it goes on to the point where, in conclusion, we may observe that D.D. Hume, the medium, frequently urged us to hold his hands and feet. During these occasions, the room was well lighted, the lamp was frequently placed on and under the table, and every possible opportunity was afforded us for the closest inspection. And we submit this one emphatic declaration: we know that we were not imposed upon nor deceived. So that article, articles back then even, they would get picked up. It might be written in the Springfield Republican, but if you go and start looking at some of these newspaper search engines, that article pops up in about 50 different newspapers. So that traveled all across the country. So in 1855, he heads to England. He's in Florence from 1855 to 1856, and he kind of behaves badly when he's in Florence. He gossips a lot. I think he gets a little full of himself, and he makes some enemies. And the spirits claim that, they're taking his power away for a year. So for a year, he has no power, nothing, no seances. And it's during that time he actually converts to Catholicism. But when his power comes back in February of 1857, he's in France, and that's when the emperor finds out about him and invites him over to the palace. And then he goes to Russia in 1858. That's when he gets married. And then he's back into England again by the early 1860s. So while he's in 1855, when he first comes to England, one of his famous sittings he gives to Sir David Brewster. Brewster was a scientist, did a lot of optical science work. He invented the kaleidoscope. And he also wrote a book on Letters on Natural Magic, which was basically exposing a lot of supernatural stuff. So he was kind of an anti-supernaturalist. So he is invited to a sitting with Hume in June of 1855. And from all accounts, everybody says that he's bowled over, and he apparently says this upsets the philosophy of 150 years. And he quotes Shakespeare and says there are more things dreamt of, than could be thought of in our philosophy. And Hume writes a letter back to someone here in Norwich that gets picked up by the newspapers, where Hume says, "Oh, I've converted Sir David Brewster, and he's very." He is privately a believer. Well, this gets into the newspapers, and Brewster sees this, and he's not happy. And he writes a letter back saying, that is false. It was all tricks, and I wasn't allowed to look under the table, and this didn't happen, and this didn't happen, and this didn't happen. And he threatened libel on Hume's autobiography when it was written and everything else. But when he dies, his daughter publishes his letters. And one of his letters is written to his diary talking about the seance, and it supports that he was originally very puzzled. Now, he didn't believe it was spirits, but he says something weird is going on here, and he basically hangs his own testimony with his contemporary writings. This is, I mentioned Edward Lytton, his son, Robert. This is a letter he writes in July of 1855 to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So he's starting to get into the Browning circle here. And this is a contemporaneous letter. So he says, "My dear Mrs. Browning, I was at Mr. Hume's, or rather Mr. Rymer's." Mr. Rymer was a solicitor. He was one of the people who took up Hume and let him stay at his house when he first came to England. "I was at Mr. Rymer's last night, and as I know your interest in these supposed manifestations, I write to you, though in great haste, a line to say what I saw and heard and felt. First, I heard raps, as they call them, though they are not at all like raps, loud at times as a brass knocker. I should say about 20 of all different tone, at the same time, not only in the table, but various parts of the room, and so strong at times as to shake all the furniture. They were almost frightful at one time. 2, I heard an accordion played upon with apparent great skill so as to produce real melody and as loud as an organ, and also saw it moved up and down without any apparent agency. When placed in my father's hand, it produced sound but not melody. 3, I saw a large drawing room table with books, ornaments, and a heavy lamp on it, uplifted and so tilted over as to almost be upset without displacing ornaments, books, or lamp. It remained so, without hands upon it. No pressure could have so uplifted it. It appeared to be heaved up as from some power underneath, but I looked under and could discover nobody. 4, I distinctly saw several times, I should say 7 or 8 times, hands and arms of various sizes, the arm always draped. And he goes on to describe some of these, and he actually, it's a little hard to see here. It's a little blurry. He actually draws for her what the arm looked like. And so you have the hand here, and then he describes it, and a lot of people would describe it, there was often this drapery, white drapery around from the wrist down. My legs, when sitting at the table, were seized under the table by a very powerful grasp, everybody's hands being at that time on the table, and on looking under it, I could discover nothing. A bell was conveyed to me from a hand of a person sitting at the opposite side of the table and placed in my own by an agency which I could neither discover nor account for. Rings were several times taken out of my hand by these spectral fingers and placed on the fingers of other persons present. I frequently tried to clutch the supposed spiritual hand. It did not melt in one's grasp, but eluded it with a sudden and brisk withdrawal as that of a skillful human being might do. The touch was always soft, warm, and human in its nature, and I could feel at times the nails. My father was seized by a hand so strong that, believing it to be a bona fide human hand and determined to trace it to its owner, he retained firm hold of it and was dragged half under the table. When it broke from his hold, at the same moment the room was filled with sounds so loud and violent to shake everything. A very strong man could hardly have produced them. Now it also says Mr. Hume went twice into a trance and gave us a sort of inspired lecture, but what he said was really great twaddle. And so that connects, that was right, that letter was written to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and she and her husband on that day had a seance with Hume themselves at Mr. Reimer's house as well. And they came away with complete, same sitting, but they write very differently. Elizabeth Barrett Browning writes to her sister and says, "We were touched by the invisible, heard the music and raps, saw the table moved, and had sight of the hands. Also, at the request of the medium, the spiritual hands took from the table a garland which lay there and placed it upon my head. The particular hand which did this was of largest human size, as white as snow, and very beautiful. It was as near to me as this hand which I write with, and I saw it as distinctly. I was perfectly calm, not troubled in any way, and felt convinced in my own mind that no spirit belonging to me was present on the occasion. The hands which appeared at a distance from me I put my glass to look at, proving that they were not mere mental impression and that they were subject to the usual laws of vision. To me it was wonderful and conclusive, and I believe that the medium present was no more responsible for the things said and done than I am myself." Now, Robert Browning says, he's writing to another person. He says, "I don't in the least pretend to explain how the table was uplifted altogether. The table and vibration do not seem inexplicable. Nor how my wife's gown was agitated, nor how the accordion was played. But light in some and leave to investigate in other of these cases were necessary to show whether they might not have been explained and easily. On the whole, I think the whole performance most clumsy and unworthy anybody really setting up for a medium. The poorest of mechanicians can fancy such an obvious contrivance as a tube, fixed or flexible, under Mr. Hume's loose clothes and sack-like pillow and ornament sleeves, which should convey some half a dozen strings and no more to his breast, for instance, and work those 3 Fantocini hands after these various fashions." So, yeah. So, and that was his first impressions, and they get worse after that. Browning became obsessed with Hume to the point where, in that first letter, that was written 2 days after the seance. So that's his first impression. It's a very detailed letter, but there's no exposure or anything. Years later, Browning's telling people, "Oh, I caught him using his foot under the table trying to kiss my wife's," and all this, and and he claims that there was this big exposure, and all these people were saying, "Oh yeah, Robert Browning caught him in fraud." So Browning began to exaggerate that. He and his wife got into some very violent. Their letters are very well preserved. I mean, a lot of her letters in that time period are about spiritualism. She says, Robert, people will come to the house and want to talk about spiritualism. She's like, "No, Robert's here. We don't want to do that." And so Browning wrote it's a fairly well-known poem. That's not considered to be one of his better works, but it's called Mr. Sludge the Medium, which kind of gives you an indication of what he thought about Hume. He wrote it in 1860, but Elizabeth didn't die until 1861. He didn't publish it until after she was dead. It starts off, it's basically about a medium. It's not Hume, but it is Hume. It starts off with a medium in Boston being exposed during a seance. It says, "Now, don't expose me. Just this once. This is the first and only time, I'll swear." Later, I cheated when I could, rapped with my toe joints, set sham hands at work, wrote down names, weak and sympathetic ink, rubbed odic lights with the ends of phosphor match, and all the rest. So it's this long, very long drama about this medium. He's a hoodwinker. It's about spiritualists and how credulous they are. So he had very, very intense feelings about all of that. In 1860, there was an article published in the Porno magazine, which was kind of like a New Yorker or an Atlantic magazine of the day in London. So it was very serious readership. And a man named Robert Bell wrote this article. He had a seance with Hume, and it was a very positive seance. And it was interesting. It was edited by William Thackeray, who did Vanity Fair, a very famous writer. And Thackeray himself had seances with Hume and was convinced, but was very reluctant to say anything about it. But he writes, in support of Robert Bell, saying, "I know this is hard to believe, but I, give him the benefit of the doubt here." Bell describes Hume floating around a room, and a lot of people they suffered a major subscription loss as a result of this article being published, and the press had a field day with all of this. So this is how this was a cartoon. This was actually Charles Foster, I pointed out before. But he's kind of this poor, and then the sitters are portrayed as geese and donkeys. This is how they were portrayed. And then this is Punch, which was kind of a satiric magazine, famous London magazine. That was comedic and satiric, and that's Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And this is this wreath that she was apparently crowned with by the hand, but in this case you can kind of see it's these lacy tongs, these gloves on top of tongs that are being extended out and putting that on her head. And they call this thing home, great home, Through humbugs and fallacies, though we may roam, be they never so artful, there's no case like home. With a lift from the spirits he'll rise in the air, though his lights are put out first, we can't see him there. Of itself his accordion to play will begin, if you won't look too hard at the works hid within. Spirit hands at his bidding will come and touch and go, but you mustn't peep under the table, So in 1868, in 1866, this elderly lady, Jane Leon, offers to adopt, and she feels like she's a very wealthy woman, but she doesn't have a lot of status. She loves the fact that Hume knows all these famous people, and she even was quoted from other people saying, "Now I get to meet them great folks that you know," or something. So she was a very interesting person. She pays him £60,000. She gives him the money. He says, I don't really need it, but she insisted he had this money, which is $15 million today. And he said it's an enormous amount of money. But then she changes her mind and she wants the money back and accuses him of swindling her. And so there's this big trial, and a lot of people show up to it. There's there are a lot of interesting elements with it. But the bottom line is that it comes down to did he influence her or not. The judge, though, thinks that states that she cannot be relied upon at all. But he also says spiritualism is mischievous nonsense, well calculated to delude the vain, weak, foolish, and superstitious who assist the progress of the needy and the eventual. So he tells Hume he has to pay the money back to him, which he does, but he uses some of that money to buy his aunt and uncle a home in New Jersey, which I believe is still there. It's a very large house. So he goes broke basically because he has to give. He had spent this money, and then he has to give what little he has back. This is actually a photo I have. This is a distillery, carte de vis. These are the kind of things they would have. They would be kind of business cards at the time. And so it's kind of interesting because this was about the time he got adopted. He took her name for a brief period of time, Daniel Hume Leon. And the press had a field day with this, saying they called it Daniel in the Leon's Den. Yes, and she was 75. And I mean, there were all kinds of insinuations about there being a relationship between them. And one of the journalists said, I shudder to even contemplate that possibility. So he's at a very low point. He has no money, and his reputation is very damaged. And at this time, he befriends a Scottish Lord Adair, who is the son of the Earl of Dunley, Ireland, and another nobleman in New Orleans. These are men in their 20s and 30s, so they're a little young. They're younger than he is. And he has an apartment in Westminster in 1868 called Ashley House. And these are all detailed in a book. The Earl of Dunley and his son write these letters. The son preserves all these letters. He starts writing these letters to his father because his father says, okay, this might be of interest. Have these seances with you and write back to me about what you're seeing, what's going on. And so there's about 50 seances described in this book. And the Earl himself, they have him over to their house, which still Adair Manor in Ireland. I've stayed there. It's very interesting. And it's a very, very rare book. And one of the things that he describes, Adair does, is this Ashley Place meditation, which occurs in 1868. So apparently he flies out to the window. So I think I have a video. I will show that rather than describe it. This is, very few representations. I mean, I have more media. But there's many, many pictures of Hume. There's more pictures of Hume than there are of Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln's life was obviously cut short a little earlier, but I mean, there's at least 30 different photos of Hume, which at that time, photography was not that widespread. It's pretty remarkable how many. But there's very few reenactment. I mean, something that's so dramatic visually, you think. There's been very little representations done in television or movies or anything. But this was a show called Science of Levitation, put on by the BBC in the late 90s. Jonathan Pryce, if you're familiar with him as the actor, he's the voice of the voice.
And millions were enthralled by the Victorian spiritualist Daniel Douglas Hume, an American-born medium who convinced high society from the US to Russia of his amazing psychic talent. Known as the medium who was never exposed, Hume was the most celebrated of all the Victorian psychics. And one event from his controversial life provides the most often cited testimony for human levitation. Aged 35, Hume was already famous worldwide as a medium who could perform all kinds of paranormal feats. He had many aristocratic friends and enjoyed a particularly close relationship with the young Lord Adair. On this evening in December 1868, Hume proposed that his friend should take part in a séance. What happened next has puzzled investigators for over a century. Lord Adair's account suggests that Hume's body took on a strange form.
He got up and walked around the room. He was elongated and raised in the air. He spoke in a whisper as if the spirits were arranging something.
The other witnesses later claimed that they'd seen flashes of light and a shape like a bird fluttering around Hume's head. Whatever the cause of these phenomena may have been, the men were transfixed by the medium's behavior. the three men to remain in their seats while he went into an adjoining room. The aristocrats hardly dared move. They heard the window opening in the next room. As they peered through the darkness, the figure of the psychic suddenly appeared at their window. He seemed to be in a trance and floating in the air. Subsequent press reports were even more dramatic than the accounts given by Lord Adair and his friends. So how had Hume transported himself from one window to the next? Those who've studied the case have suggested that he must have rigged a rope to bridge the gap, but this cannot be known for sure. And this wasn't Hume's only levitation that evening. When Adair asked him to explain how he'd accomplished his feat, the psychic took him to the open window in the next room. This is what Lord Adair said he saw. We may never learn the full truth of what happened that evening, but because Lord Adair and his friends were men of such high social standing, their account was widely accepted without question. Hume's feat remains a mystery.
There were several mistakes. Saying he was American born and a terrible wig on that. But now, and that wasn't, there were a lot of people that were critical of that account too. It's been taken apart a lot because in that instance, he goes out one room and into the other, so it's, how does it get from one end to the other? But actually, I mean, that gets a lot of attention, that levitation, but I mean, he had many other levitations that were, honestly, more interesting, just as described. So there's a man named Charles Maurice Davies, who was a clergyman. He was also a very good, talented writer. He wrote a lot of articles about the religious scene in London, the 1850s, the 60s, the 70s. He wrote for the Daily Telegraph newspaper. And he got interested when he was in Paris around the time Hume was there with the emperor. He got heard accounts of his seances and got very interested in the whole subject of spiritualism. So he began having settings with a number of different mediums. And what's interesting about him is that he was not a fool. He was actually very sharp. He understood conjuring. He talked to a lot of magicians. He saw a lot of mediums, and he said, a lot of them, this is a lot of nonsense. But he had a sitting with Hume, and he was very impressed by him. But he describes it, Hume's levitation. He says, it was at Mr. Hall's house, Samuel Carter Hall. I met Daniel D. Hume, who had indirectly been the means of my first inquiring into these matters. In a very early period of my acquaintance with this remarkable personage, I witnessed the phenomena of levitation. We were sitting in the afterglow of a bright summer evening, the room being otherwise unlighted. Hume had his back to the window, and I was sitting at the table exactly opposite him. I could see him quite distinctly, and after sundry other manifestations, I beheld him rise perpendicularly in the air. After he had risen some distance, and in evident unconsciousness that he had done so, he said, "I think I shall be levitated today." I told him he had already risen, and he again said, "No, but I think I shall." He then rose higher still until his feet were above the level of the table, when he turned gently over into a horizontal position and floated towards me with his toes steering straight for my nose. I asked him whether I should move, and he replied, "No, sit still, I shall clear you." He was then about 18 inches above the table, and as he passed me, he said, "Follow me, and pass your hands above and below me." I assured him there was no necessity for this, as I had no suspicions, but he repeated, "Do as I tell you. I want you to be able to say that you have done it." I followed him out into the darkness, and I kept passing my hands above and below him until he was floated right back around the room and then back again as buoyantly as a balloon into his place. Now, I do not expect people of necessity to believe this. Possibly I was hypnotized, as might also have been my wife, our host and hostess, and the 5 or 6 other people present. Cranes and other cumbrous machinery I do not believe in. I think we should have seen them before or after the seance, and they would have looked altogether out of place in that elegantly furnished drawing room. If we were not hypnotized, that man was in space for several minutes, and I handled him while he was making the circuit of a fairly sized room. There was nothing necessarily spiritual in the exhibition, but what had become our good old reputation and served as a good example. Now, stage conjurers, prior to Hume, mostly what you would see on stage was what's called suspension. It was where somebody would be, this was like Robert Houdin, was one of the famous magicians, was his son, this was a famous actor. He lift him up here and he would be supported on a rock. That's called suspension. But an actual levitation where there was no attachment really came into being from a man named John Neville Maskelyne, very famous magician in the 1800s. And he took, I think, a lot of his inspiration from hearing about Hugh seances and trying to reproduce them. He got his start in magic. He watched the Davenports perform and caught them escaping from the ropes when they were tied in the cabin. That's how he got interested in magic. So he wanted to emulate how Hugh spiritualists. So his first suspension was of his wife, and basically it was this very large piece of equipment hidden behind the curtain. And she had a metal thing around her waist that was attached to this thing, and somebody would be kind of cranking it up, and she would kind of jerkily go up and down. And so Davies, who saw this performance and had seen Hume float, kind of gives you a comparison. He says, "But I myself have seen Mr. Hume float around Mr. Samuel Carter Hall's drawing room and handled him above and below the transit to me. Quite failed to discern any reproduction of that phenomenon in the heavy, lumbery levitation of the lady by means of the scissors-like apparatus behind her, which we are only privileged to behold from the stalls." So, he was not impressed with Masculine's reproduction of Hume, however Hume was accomplishing that. So, 1869 to 1873, Sir William Crookes, who invented the Crookes tube and discovered thallium. He was a very prominent scientist at that time. Maybe you've heard of his name in chemistry or physics class. Well, he got interested in spiritualism. And so he starts having sittings with Hume and publishes some tests, including an accordion test. This is the kind of accordion that he used. And so he's holding it here, the keys are down here. And he would put this in a cage, too, underneath the table. He was trying to see if electricity had any effect on it. He would run a current through that. It was like a fire cage. And then he had a spring balance test as well. And so while the accordion was under there, it would play, and Hume would take his hand out, and he would just kind of sit there in the air, and it would still be playing. And they'd look under the table, and Hume would have his hands up above the table, and this thing was still floating around. Of course, nobody else believed this. And another test that he did was the spring balance test. So Hume would be sitting down, and he had his board, and being held up by a balance. And so he would be sitting there with his hand on the board, and the board would push down or push up, and it was attached to a recorder, a pen, that would record the amount of force being used to push the board up or down. So this is kind of a representation of what it was looking at. So Crookes published these accounts, and many scientists, and he invited scientists. He said, "Come see this for yourself." And many of them didn't want to do it, but they were very easy to, they was like, did Mr. Hume furnish that board himself? Was that his board? And Crookes said, "Well, my critics give me some ounce of common sense." He said, "Of course it's my board." But these privately, a lot of scientists were kind of interested, and in the long run, this was really the beginnings of parapsychology. The Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882. many of the people who joined it probably would have been founded anyway without Hume, but I think that these experiments by Crookes attracted a lot more attention from prominent scientists of the day. And so they joined that organization. So this was really one of the first, organized scientific tests for paranormal phenomenon. And Crookes eventually published his notes. I mean, this is just a sample of some of the notes. And so he would actually be taking the notes during the seance. So he would be there writing while other people were observing. And, he would indicate who was sitting where. And in this case, this is where a sofa was. And then it moves here 3 feet, and then it goes 9 feet. There was a thing where the table, he would say, the one person would say, I want the table to be heavy. And then everybody would try to lift the table up, and they couldn't do it. It was like magnetized to the floor. And then they would say, be light. And then all of a sudden, it would fly, go right up the air. It would weigh nothing. Obviously a magnet would sound like, that could be accomplished by a major magnet, but if this was in Crookes' own home. So he would have had to somehow attach a huge magnet under his floor, knowing about it. And that's where the term psychic comes from. It comes actually from a man who was working with Crookes named Edward William Cox. So they developed this concept, okay, they're saying it's not fraud, but it's not spirits that are doing this either. We think it's something coming from people like the mind, that we're able to control this, and they're calling this a psychic force. And so they introduced another possibility. But it didn't quell the criticism from people here. So I talked about Hume's elongations. This was a person who actually had Hume put his hand down when he was being elongated onto a piece of paper and traced his hand. The middle hand is his normal hand, and then his fingers would stretch out and then shrink. And he would shrink in and out. And so these are some of the accounts of his elongation. But his waistcoat, they could actually feel his flesh shrinking, they said. And he would stretch out about a foot in length. He would lay on the floor, and he would just get it. So they could test that out. And his face, they said, it would expand like a balloon, and then shrink like. No, there's no photographs. And materialization. So this was a sitting Crookes had with Hume. They were all sitting in here, and Hume has Mr. Crookes' wife, Ellen, go sit into the next room. There's a fire going. There's a little bit of light. It's not bright, but there's some light. And Hume is standing kind of in between the two rooms, at these two folding doors. And she said all the people see this figure, this transparent figure. They can see through it, so they can see her through this thing. This thing forms and takes an accordion in his hand and like is floating around the room playing it, and like kind of comes up towards her, and she starts freaking out, and then it disappears. So this is her, these are a couple of accounts of her witnessing that. So I mentioned, in 1877, at that point, Hume his health is declining, so he stops giving seances. But he publishes this book that exposes fraudulent mediums. One of which is the Eddy brothers. These are guys that they were giving seances up in this place in Vermont, which is actually still there. It's a ski club. It's interesting. I went up there. I looked it up, and I was like, oh, this place is still there. It was originally a farmhouse. It's now a ski club. And they still talk about, they're like, we held seances here. But these brothers would, they were behind a curtain, and they'd be tied up, and then all of a sudden these Native Americans would come out and play, it sounded very, it was a scam. And Hume exposed it as a scam, and he exposed the guy who wrote about the Eddy brothers favorably was this Henry Alcott, who became a very prominent, he and this woman, Madame Blavatsky, they founded the Theosophy, which became really laid the groundwork for a lot of cult groups here in the 20th century. So he made big enemies with them, and that's part of the reason why I think he's been kind of erased from history, because I think Blavatsky hated him, and so did Alcott for making him look like a fool. And that damaged his reputation. Now, Twain became friends with Hume when he was in Europe traveling. Twain did not, at that time, Hume wasn't giving seances, so Twain never saw a seance, but he liked Hume. He called Hume a very fine fellow. Hume actually translated his Innocent Tramp Abroad into Russian, and in one of his letters to Hume, Twain says, "It seems an excellent translation. At any rate, it looks funnier than it does in English." And it's interesting, Twain also writes to somebody else and says, "Yeah, I met Hume, he's a very fine fellow." He's like, "Some people say he looks kind of like me." there is a bit of a resemblance. It's funny, on that first picture I showed where he's holding the skull, I used to have that as my Facebook profile, and a friend of mine wrote to me and said, "Why do you have a picture of Mark Twain holding a basketball?" So he dies in 1886. That's his tombstone. He's buried in France. Corinthians, the quotation there on his tombstone, to another discerning of spirits. So, explanations, conjuring, hypnotism, drugs, lying, exaggeration, malobservation, all of these are perfect, examples. This is a quote from Angelo Lewis, who was known as Professor Hoffman, very famous 19th century magician. He wrote what's considered to be one of the best magic books ever. It's called Modern Magic. Original copies of it are in magic circles, very, very attractive. And he was part, so he, when they were reviewing his wife's book about Hume, they gave this to Angelo Lewis and said, as a conjurer, what do you think? And I think that his quotes are very apt. It says, "I have read and considered Hume's life from the conjurer's point of view, but find it extremely difficult to give any safe opinion on it. Assuming the general good faith of the witnesses, I should still make very large deductions from malobservation and looseness of description. Many of the facts asserted are not, as described, explainable by any conjuring expedients within my knowledge. But this is by no means conclusive. Experience teaching that upon any question of the marvelous, ordinary observers are absolutely untrustworthy as witnesses. I frequently had minute accounts of admitted conjuring tricks, which, as described, I could not explain. Though when I have subsequently seen the thing done, the solution has been perfectly clear. People describing magical illusions tell you not what they saw done, but what they think was done, which is often a totally different matter." So, of course, you have, paranormal explanations, not just for Hume, but for spiritualism in general. Spirits of the dead was what spiritualists studied. There was the psychic force option. There was Satan. A lot of the religious figures, said, okay, we admit that these things are real, but they're evil. You need to don't mess around with these things. Fairies, I talked about Buller Lytton. He said, he had the idea that these things were some kind of weird, not fairies per se, but like these little, mischievous entities or something. Or, something else. And so these are a couple of figures. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip through those. Those are a couple of figures that prominent skeptics who nonetheless had very complimentary things to say about it. But I think this is a quote from a short story. Have you guys seen The Illusionist with Edward Norton? Okay, so this is the short story it was based on. Very different. The short story is very different. They borrowed the outline. There was no romance aspect or anything of that stuff. It was called Eisenheim the Illusionist by Stephen Williams. The general gist, though, this magician shows up, does these traditional tricks, very successful. Royalty, very bold over and everything else. Then he disappears for a while. Comes back, and he just takes a chair out, sits there, and these spirits materialize on the stage out of nowhere, and then they disappear. And they're people who have been dead, and all of a sudden he's this mysterious spiritual figure. Then all of a sudden he disappears one day, and they ransack his place where he had all his tricks and everything. And they find all his cabinets and all his stuff for his normal tricks, but not for the spiritual stuff. They can't find any explanation for it. He just disappears and he never shows up. And so the story ends with, quote, as precise memories faded in the everyday world of coffee cups, doctor visits, and workmen's return, a secret relief penetrated the souls of the faithful, who knew that the master had passed safely out of the crumbling order of history and into the indestructible realm of history. And there's a postscript that I thought was kind of interesting. And this is something else that nobody's found out in his biographer. It's rather amazing. The most famous article, or the most famous writing about miracles, against miracles, is by a philosopher named David Hume. He wrote an inquiry concerning human understanding. Anybody who's a philosopher knows David Hume. He's a very famous philosopher. He was a historian, so he saw this from a historical point of view. And he wrote, in his inquiry concerning human understanding, he wrote a chapter called Miracles. And he says, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood will be miraculous in the fact which it endeavors to establish. So he's basically saying that, you need extraordinary amount of evidence to overcome the natural order of things. We see things each day, they do this, they don't deviate from that. So if we're going to claim that a miracle actually happened, the testimony is going to have to be extremely strong. And that basically has been said in many other ways. Carl Sagan, famous scientist, writer, came up had the claim of extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence. Basically, that was all just spin on all of Hume. So Hume was the one who formulated the strongest testimony, or the strongest argument against miracles. So Hume, in his biography, David Hume, says, I was born the 26th of April, 1711, Old Style of Edinburgh. I was of a good family, both of father and mother. My father's family is a branch of the Earl of Humes. And so, if Daniel Hume is related to the Earl of Hume, and Dave Hume is related to the Earl of Hume, the man who came up with the argument against miracles is faced with a man who perhaps presents the strongest argument for miracles. So that's where I'll leave you. I mean, there's a sort of a very interesting juxtaposition. And and nobody's ever made that connection before. I mean, we've always remarked a little bit about, well, isn't it funny that David Hume has the same, they have the same sounding name. That's kind of weird. But I came across a letter recently, well, not a couple years ago, early in his life, and it said, young man, Daniel Hume, the spiritualist, he's actually related to the famous historian. And I was like, related? And I was like, is David Hume from the Earl of Hume family? And sure enough, he was. And nobody's ever made that. So, I mean, it's, if indeed he is from the Hume family, I mean, they're blood relations. I think that's very, very odd. Now, of course, David Hume was 100 years before